Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm LELDF President Jason Johnson, joined by LELDF Policy Director Sean Kennedy. Sean, we got a great interview this week with Julie Parker of Julie Parker Communications. I've known Julie for many years. I've worked with her in the Prince George's County Police Department in Maryland, and she was a communications director at the time. She is fantastic. Her firm consults with, trains literally thousands of law enforcement professionals across the country in how to deal with mostly crisis communications, but really all forms of communications. But looking at the crisis communications, I mean, there's just so much out there where agencies are sometimes, unfortunately, ill-prepared to deal with a crisis. Like, they act like it's not going to happen. But it always does.
Yeah, I mean, what you really learned from Julie, and not only her expertise, but the examples she uses, is how much transparency matters and how that maintains and builds trust. And when you lose that trust, it's so hard to gain it back. The best remedy to misinformation is the most information, is to really flood the zone, come out early. We've seen a number of examples with high-profile shootings where misinformation got around, and when the police acted quickly, released body cam footage right away, it dispels all the myths and it lets the truth come out sooner rather than later.
So the day we did the interview was the day after the shooting in Madison, Wisconsin, which is now all over the national news. And she was the first person that let me know during the interview that the cops in Madison apparently don't have body cameras. Can you believe it?
I mean, it's a huge city. It's a very liberal town. That police department's had other high-profile shootings. The problem in this case, why this is even a controversy, is because they didn't have the body cams. If they did, in all likelihood, this debate would go away and the shooting would be perceived, at least, as justified. The investigation would proceed apace, but the public wouldn't be outraged because they'd have all the information, and they don't right now. So it leaves that gap between what we know and what we don't know, and people are, jumping to conclusions.
This communications business for police departments is complicated. It's difficult. A lot of times cops think they can do everything. Like, there's no task that they can't master. And it's really not true. There are elements of the job of running a police department in particular that require certain professionals. And I think the crisis communications, not that police chiefs and other leaders don't have a role, they have a big role, but they really do need communications professionals involved that really understand from an outsider's point of view about how things look. And that's where Julie comes in. So it's really, really fascinating. We're here with Julie Parker. Julie is an Emmy and Edward R. Murrow award-winning former reporter in Washington, D.C. market. I went on to serve as a lead spokesperson for two Washington metropolitan area law enforcement agencies, the Prince George's County, Maryland Police Department and the Fairfax County, Virginia Police Department, where she led as a spokesperson and communications strategist. And subsequently, she has trained law enforcement, public information officers, police chiefs, police executives, police officers, and a variety of other people in the art of communication. She's lectured regularly at the FBI National Academy, served as a senior media advisor for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and she also leads her own communications firm, Julie Parker Communications, where she advises law enforcement agencies and other organizations on managing communications with the media, on social media, and in many other ways during routine communication as well as crisis communication and probably everything in between. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Good to have you. I've been looking forward to having you on the podcast for a while, and we got a lot of stuff to talk about.
We do. Where do you want to start?
Well, here's where I want to start. I want to start with your background as a reporter. So you came to the law enforcement space after a long time serving as a local reporter, anchor, and reported a lot on issues involving law enforcement. So breaking news involving law enforcement officers, routine day-to-day type things involving law enforcement officers, and then you kind of, I hate to say switch teams because it's not really two different teams, but it kind of is. So, first of all, what was that like? I would say just making that transition, and then the follow-up to that is going to be, what was the one thing that you didn't know about, that you learned about law enforcement organizations, that you learned about when you became part of law enforcement?
what I realized leaving a newsroom and being out in the field reporting and then coming to represent the first of two large agencies where I worked is sadly how little I knew about the profession that I had to cover as part of my role in a top 10 media market. And I think the assumption on the side of law enforcement is that, oh, the media knows what we do. The public gets what we do. And it was so very apparent as soon as I switched teams, as you said, how little not just the media, but the public knew about this profession. And one thing in particular was the intense amount of training that takes place was shocking to me. Training on the side of law enforcement, to be clear, not on the side of media. And I felt that one of my initial missions when joining the first police department was we have to educate the public, as basic as it sounds, in everything that we do. If we're going to talk about a fatal collision investigation, we're going to explain what the process is. If we have an officer involved shooting, we're not just going to talk about the details about that incident that we can. We're also going to explain that there's always a process and this is how it works. Education has to be a part of every conversation that law enforcement has with the public. But I would encourage you to watch a news conference, to start scanning social media platforms of the agencies that you follow, and pay attention to how much education or how little education is being shared. And you can't forget that component of your communication strategy.
Law enforcement in general, law enforcement officers probably in particular, and at all ranks, the most senior ranks to the most junior ranks, have a general distrust for the media, is probably putting it mildly. Just in general, not everyone, but just in general.
Right.
And I think on the flip side, there's a perception and maybe to some degree a reality that reporters, when they're covering law enforcement officers and agencies, are expecting to find something wrong. So if you think of like a critical incident, like a police involved shooting is the prototypical critical incident, law enforcement officers and agencies expect it to be misreported and made to appear more controversial or questionable than it really is. That's the perception. I guess would say, is there any reality to that? And how would you, from within a law enforcement organization, try to reach out to the media and try to build bridges so that there's a little bit more mutual understanding? I know you've done this yourself, probably on both sides, but I've actually seen it on the law enforcement side of trying to proactively build bridges so there's more trust between the two.
I'll get to the proactive pieces second, because I think that's the easier thing to do. To this day, there still exists a mistrust for the media at the way that it did when I joined the profession in 2011. But that is in part due to the way the media landscape has changed. Journalism at its core is different in 2026 as compared to 2011 when I first left news and started representing an agency. And are there one-offs in every single profession who don't do the right thing, who come out something with the wrong intention, who have an agenda, who are all about themselves and trying to make it about them? Of course. But my experience has been both working in the Washington, D.C. TV market and then working for agencies in that same media market, that for the most part, journalists are trying to do the best that they can with the resources and oversight that they either have or don't have. I've seen the one-offs. They're not hard to find. They're easily identifiable, and I think they should be treated accordingly. Our philosophy was always that if the local media calls, we will answer. To what degree we answer will depend on what the incident is, what our man and women power is at that moment, and yes, what our relationship is like with that reporter and that media outlet. So if 16 calls are coming in about a police matter and there are 2 reporters of the 16 who have never given us a fair shake, who clearly come at any police story with some sort of angle or bias. I'll call them back, but they'll be called back 15th and 16th. We'll still do the job that is important for us to do as a government agency to communicate with the media who covers us. But it doesn't mean I'm going to give you special favors. And someone's got to be called back last. And that is not what any member of the media wants. They want the news first. They want to break the news. And it's just a way to show that it's a two-way street. This is a two-way street. And my experience, I'm pleased to say, is that for the most part, most reporters are there to do a fair job. And I don't know that police officers agree with that. And I know if you're personally burned, it's going to leave a mark. I've been burned as a media relations director by members of the media. And in some cases, I'll give them a second chance. And in other cases, I'll do the bare minimum because it's evident what you're doing. And so to the second part of your question about proactive media relations, that was a very important part of my team's strategy to help the agency. A good, strong, solid media relations strategy can only benefit a law enforcement agency. And yelling at them and shutting them down and ignoring them and trying to exert your authority by keeping them back 4 miles because you can is not going to help the agency. And it's so easy to do. It really just comes down to making the time for them. Everyone has too much on their plates. Our list of things to do is incredibly long. And depending on the agency where you work, your to-do list is really long. And so we battle that. We were very, very busy right outside Washington, D.C. with our agency where we both came from, the PGPD. But we needed them. We did not need to make enemies of the media who cover us. That's nonsensical. Why would you do that? And so things like a media breakfast where we bring them into headquarters, we make the executive command staff team available to them. We break bread, bagels, coffee, have conversations. This is who I am. This is what I do at the police department. Who are you? Where do you work? Just meeting people on a very normal level makes such a difference. It happens too infrequently. It's not a heavy lift, but it just has to be part of the ongoing strategy. So media breakfasts, for example, was something we did twice a year at both the agencies where I worked because it's easy and it works and you get positive media coverage and they get to see your deep bench and meet people in a different, more meaningful way, which typically will make you like the other person more.
I think it works on the other side too for the people within law enforcement when they meet reporters and talk to them on a more, personal level. They don't have to be best friends. They don't always have to see everything the same way, but it just has this subconscious or unconscious way of building relationships where it works. And there is this symbiosis between reporters and law enforcement, especially people in leadership roles where they really depend on each other. The police department needs the media because they want to make sure their story gets told the right way. So they do need them. They're going to exist no matter what. You can like it or not like it, how they report, but they're going to report. You can either influence it or you can not influence it. And it's up to you. And that, I think, there are 18,000 police departments in the United States, give or take. And most of them are really small. Most of them are just a handful of police officers. They're just small operations. They don't necessarily have the ability to have a full-time media relations person. So everyone becomes a generalist. And that's kind of where firms like yours come in to help support that, I think, in really important ways. But that's, I think, the transition we've seen even in the bigger departments that do have their own in-house media relations capacity. It's very professional. Typically now it's led by someone with media experience, not a cop, And
I've had 2 conversations this week one was executive command staff and one was with a police chief and his assistant chief about trying to find and hire the right person to lead that media relations function. And it is hard to identify the right person. What I found really noteworthy was that from the perspective of both police departments, they were not leaning toward wanting a sworn person to do that role. There has been a pretty big shift where, like Chief McGaw did back in the day when he hired me, his thought was, I want a media person for this media job. Well, this job is much more than media. Social media is a huge component of it, but if you've come from the media, you generally know both pieces. But what I found interesting this week in talking with these police leadership executives is that they don't want their people for this. They want someone who has communication strategy in their genes and knows inherently what to do. In fact, a chief that I spoke with today, he asked one of his sworn mid-level supervisor if they had a style book. And the mid-level supervisor looked at the chief and said, I don't know what you're talking about.
What's that?
What's that? But if you ask a communications person about a style book, what's our style guide? They know that. And so, I couldn't be a detective. And so why should it be assumed that someone who's sworn can just naturally slide into this role? They can. I know plenty of excellent sworn public information officers, but the profession, it feels like, is really gravitating toward, let's get a media professional in that role.
Well, it's important. I mean, I can address that from just close observation that it's very important that, old school police departments relied on police officers to do every job, everything from media relations to the accounting and fiscal management of the department were done by people that don't necessarily have specific training in that area. They just picked it up and learned it. And that's obviously not the best way to do anything. It's not the best way to run any organization. Police departments are figuring that out. Cops are important for cop jobs, but police departments have lots of other functions that are better done by professionals, and communications and media relations obviously is one of those areas. So I want to kind of start focusing on the types of things where you come in, where there's really overlap between what LELDF stands for and what we normally talk about on holding the line, and where you have expertise. And that's really in responding to critical incidents. And what I'm primarily talking about are police-involved shootings, but also it could be an in-custody death. It could be a high-profile use of force. It could be anything really controversial that's breaking news and that police departments have to respond to. So I'll just ask you a big, broad question. First of all, is that in your view, especially as your career has evolved and you've gotten deeper into the law enforcement communication, do you see the crisis communication response to any of the above to be almost something where you need to have a strict sort of protocol, or that the police chief sees the communications piece alongside the investigation and the follow-up and all the other functions the department have? In other words, was communication, the communications and media relations piece used to be an afterthought, but now it's really part of the response?
It's 100% important that it be a part of the initial response. Few things make my blood boil more than hearing about a comms person not having a seat at the table, whether the table is in the chief's conference room, whether the table is out at the scene where everyone's in the huddle finding out what's going on. You can't play the game of telephone when it comes to a law enforcement critical incident as it relates to your comms person, whether they are a part-time PIO or your comms director, media relations director in charge of 15 people or more. You have to trust the person who is at the helm to be responsible for the overarching strategy, but also to instill in the team a sense of urgency. And by the team, I don't just mean the PIO team. I mean, leadership has to understand, certainly in 2026, that we can't approach a critical incident, a use of force that's captured on camera that tells 30% of the story. We can't leave it to chance when it comes to an officer-involved shooting that the coverage, and I don't just mean media, but the social media coverage of something, we have to assume it's not going to go the way we want it to unless we actually get in the game and communicate early. And I've now been a crisis communications advisor full-time with my firm for 6.5 years. And one thing remains consistent. And that is, generally speaking, a lack of urgency when it comes to communicating about a crisis. This is when we get the calls, when people have waited too long to do the right thing. And it could mean they didn't know how to do the right thing. It could mean they tried to do it, but it didn't go well because it wasn't presented perhaps as robustly as we would recommend. And when you get behind, it's really hard to catch up. And you're not just dealing with the media now, you're dealing with scanner hounds who have their own social media platforms. You're dealing with everyone and their mother who is out on the street corner narrating with their phone what they say happened. And the longer an agency waits to communicate about their own incident, their news, it doesn't help. It doesn't. It gets much, much worse with time. You've got to counteract the bad information that's out there. And every single law enforcement agency should assume that at best, there will only be misinformation about whatever their incident is. At worst, disinformation, people who are actively seeking to put out bad information about your incident. And so generally speaking, everybody needs to hurry up.
Good communication strategy by law enforcement agencies protect law enforcement officers, because what happens, and we've seen it, and we could point to any number of cases. I'm going to just mention the Michael Brown case, fatal shooting in Ferguson, Missouri. That case is an example of when the department isn't in a position or isn't able to or doesn't effectively provide factual, timely information, narratives are created, and the narratives will never go away. So like the hands up, don't shoot narrative, and we talk about this all the time, and we talk about it on Holding the Line, and so it never happened. But still today, if you poll the public, and people do poll the public about such things, everyone thinks it did. And it's only because that was the narrative that got out there and it was unrebutted, and for a long time. And then eventually it was rebutted, even by the Justice Department.
For too long. It was allowed to stick.
So this is the core, and this is why we're talking to you, because it remains a problem. I mean, I see it. I know you see it. You pay tremendously close attention to these things. When some crisis happens somewhere and the communication isn't going well in the first 24 hours, it's not lost. I mean, obviously you can recover, but if you aren't prepared to, I shouldn't say fight back, but correct the narrative, put factual information out repeatedly over time, you will win it back, I think. I mean, I'm going to ask you this question ultimately, but I think you can win it back. But that's why the conversation with you is important. This isn't just a general conversation about what police chiefs should do with their communication. It's drawing a direct line between being able to effectively communicate immediately in the wake of a crisis and ultimately getting your story out, which should be the factual story, which usually is the winner for law enforcement if we could get the facts out effectively.
If I'm a police officer working for ABC Police Department and my chief consistently gets out there early and often to communicate what he or she can as an incident unfolds, I'm better off. I feel better. That is leadership in action. If there is silence and the video doesn't look good and no one at the top is talking about that, how do I feel supported as an officer? Mm-hmm. What if we were entirely in the right and the one video that gets out there is at an angle that doesn't benefit the police department, doesn't tell the full story, and we're not hearing from anyone at the agency?
Which is what happens unless the media relations person, at least the department has a media relations person that is out of your mold, who understands we need urgency, which is what you said and what I've actually seen you employ, and and are approaching it, sort of proactively, understanding you have to get control of the narrative and make sure the right information is reaching the right eyes and ears at the time. But not every department has the capability to do that. So we can sit on the sidelines and watch other departments maybe do it wrong, and they become lessons for you. And in some cases, those situations ultimately become LELDF cases because the police officer or police officers involved are always perceived by the public or by whomever as being the wrongdoers, and ultimately sometimes pay the price with their careers, or might even be prosecuted. Or sometimes that could have been prevented because you wouldn't have this groundswell of anti-police public sentiment if the story just got out there timely, right? um
I want to raise a point about resources too, and I don't mean about communications personnel. There's a story this week out of Madison, Wisconsin, where there is an officer-involved shooting. And the news is just starting to show various vantage points of the public who are recording an officer-involved shooting that takes place in an intersection. And I believe there are 5 officers involved, and the suspect has a knife. There are no body-worn cameras on these officers in Madison, Wisconsin. I haven't had the chance to look up whether those particular officers just didn't have one, didn't have it on. The department doesn't have it. But I know that there is no body-worn camera footage available for whatever the reason. I was surprised to hear that in this day and age, a city of that size is potentially operating without body-worn cameras. And, I know LELDF is a proponent of agencies having body-worn cameras because, I'm not going to quote you on the stat, but more often than not, those cameras and the video will support a police officer's actions. And so without that tool, the public is relying on whoever held up their phone and started recording, narrating it as they see fit from wherever their angle is. And maybe they never see a knife as they are narrating about this officer-involved shooting. And so I would encourage agencies to, naturally, they're up against challenges with budgets. Everybody is. But are you missing tools that can, again, help you support the people who work for you? And we know that body-worn cameras do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you put that in there. And yeah, we just had last week an op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal, really advocating for body-worn cameras generally, but in particular for ICE. And there has been recently a lot of back and forth about whether ICE will be equipped with body cameras and to what extent they'll be equipped. And our piece is just basically a wholesale from a pro-police, pro-law enforcement perspective. Body cameras are the way to go for law enforcement. Any frontline law enforcement officer should have a body-worn camera that works and is turned on when it's supposed to be on in 2026, because again, overwhelming majority of the times, it is helpful. It doesn't always tell the whole story. Obviously, it's one piece of evidence, but it's an important piece of evidence. And then you're quite right. If you don't have it, if the officer isn't recording it, someone else is. And their narration and the way that they frame it and what they're willing to later turn over or not turn over is going to be entirely up to them. So if you want the facts, you need the camera on the law enforcement officer.
The question is, how are they not equipped with body-worn cameras? It's nonsensical. So we're Capitol Hill, the Secretary of Defense is talking about the need for $1 trillion for this war. $1 trillion. Like, no one can even comprehend that number. But yet you've got ICE agents out across this country under public relations fire who don't have the most basic tools that 10 man and women police departments have in this country. What? How can we not fix that?
I don't think it's a fiscal reason. I think it's actually what inspired us to write the op-ed was, I think there's a perception, not within law enforcement circles, but maybe in law enforcement adjacent circles, like people who are consider themselves pro-police, but really don't know how police officers think or what they really do, and that think that body-worn cameras are anti-law enforcement. Putting them on is a move that shows you are against what they're doing, or you want to dissuade them from doing what they're supposed to do, or, enforcing the law. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, if you actually talk to, I'm an old guy now, and when I was young, in the police department, we didn't have cameras. It just wasn't a thing. It wasn't even technically possible. And so during the transition, yes, there were old people like me, and it wasn't me specifically. I wasn't against them, but a lot of older people that had been in the job for a long time weren't necessarily embracing it because, and I've used this quote actually even on this podcast, but I'll use it again because it's appropriate. And you know what I'm going to say. There's two things that cops don't like. They don't like change, and they don't like the way things are right now. So,
Correct.
And everybody that's in law enforcement knows that's, and body-worn cameras were no different. So at first, yes, of course, there's a little resistance. There are questions about privacy. There are all sorts of questions. They've all been answered for the most part. And the profession is heavily reliant on body-worn cameras to protect itself and to preserve the truth. And so, yeah, they should be widespread across every state, federal, local agency. As a advocate for effective crisis communication, I would guess you're generally an advocate for early release of body-worn camera footage. I mean, as a general matter, obviously there's protocols and there's laws to deal with and all that sort of thing. But the idea of having a body-worn camera and just collecting the data and using it solely for investigative purposes and never putting it before the public in the early stages is something that would be adverse to you. Is that a fair assumption?
It's a distinct disadvantage. You've got a tool. You've got something visual that people will remember. And frankly, whether the news is good, bad, or indifferent, that tool and telling people, well, we have this tool and we're going to show you what's on it later. Well, guess what people do about later? They form their opinion now and we move on. We don't sit around and wait anymore for this particular update. There are 4,000 pieces of information coming to us at every moment. You think I'm going to be like, oh, let me pause and hold my thoughts on this matter until I see the video in 90 days. That is an antiquated way of thinking, and it's not realistic. And the cycle of news is not just about a media deadline. It's about the social media cycle of news as well. And if I've got evidence that I have the ability to put out at a police department and I can't put it out at that very second, be damn sure that I'm going to be telling them when I'm going to. Because if it's in 24 hours or, give us till tonight for the chief to be able to watch this because he wants to talk to you about this matter, but he's got to watch it first. Like, you've got to communicate about the valuable tool you have at your fingertips. We're in a situation where I live now in North Carolina, where body-worn camera footage, the police department can't just release it. You need a court order to get that video released. To me, that means if I'm a police chief in North Carolina or a sheriff in North Carolina, that worries me. Because what if the judge says no? What if the process to hear from them takes however many days? And we're looking at serious repercussions for our reputation in the meantime. And so, the public doesn't understand that these rules will vary by state. So if I see Virginia putting out body-worn camera footage 60 minutes after the incident, but I'm just across the border in Carolina and I'm told, nope, we can't do it. Well, then what's my assumption as a North Carolina resident? Oh, you don't want to do it. We have to educate. And one of the police chiefs that I just spoke with, who is in North Carolina, I suggested that in all of their language about critical incidents, that they add in the template of the news release, state law regarding body-worn camera footage is such that it needs to be released only under court order. Some sort of language like that, because we have to tell the public and we can't assume they know these things.
Yeah, that's bizarre. I didn't know that was the case. I know that obviously states vary on release, and some have different protocols, and agencies have developed protocols, and that makes sense. I mean, you should have some release protocol that the media knows about, and so when they start asking about it, you might have there's a 12-hour hold period where everyone reviews it, and in ordinary circumstances, we would thereafter release it if there's not a reason not to, and if it needs to be redacted or portions of the video not shown to protect modesty or whatever the case might be, all makes sense. But if your presumption is in favor of releasing as soon as you can possibly release it, and ideally without having to go to a judge to get permission to release such a video, but they've become so integral in the storytelling of informing the public via the media what has happened in combating false information, because there's in the very early stages people are weaving narratives, and you're right to point out social media. There are people who focus their lives on as individual people via social media reporting um, uh, even police involved things, and sometimes reporting in a way that wouldn't even come close to what a journalist's ethical standards would be. They just kind of
Right.
put stuff out there, and some of it takes, and we have to counter that, as you eloquently said.
We have had police chiefs come to us in a variety of states where, for whatever reason, they aren't prepared or they don't want to put out body-worn camera footage. They are waiting for something, whether it's the media inquiring, whether it's a family member of someone who was involved in that officer-involved shooting, to say something. And so they have us take the body-worn camera footage and put together a narrated video
Yeah.
that sits on their shelf and waits until the chief says, okay, I'm going to, in case of emergency, break glass. Now I want to share this information. And so that becomes their version of a communications insurance. And, if you're not going to proactively share that video, that is a good strategy to employ, that you've got the whole thing spelled out. You've highlighted what's in the suspect's hands. You educate the public. This is what the process is. This is how this works. And you hear from the leader of that organization about the incident. And would it be my preference? No, I want everything out that we can share as much as possible, as early as possible. But in a pinch, it works.
So I'm going to share a story that I wasn't sure if I was going to share it or not. You were probably secretly hoping that I would,
I know what it
but I
is.
wasn't sure if I would or not. But, so this is so, and I'll be kind of generic about it, but like the important point is this: is it's the lesson that I learned about how to do this effectively. Is you're the director of media relations, I'm the commander of internal affairs in charge of responding to these investigations of officer involved incidents like shootings. So there's an officer involved shooting middle of the night in an apartment complex. And the reason, the circumstances are, officers get a call that there are people shooting at each other on the parking lot of this apartment complex, which was believable. Shootings had happened at this apartment complex before. It wouldn't be that out of the ordinary. They respond. They find a couple of guys out on the parking lot, and both of them seem to have guns in their hands. The officers challenge them, and one guy just doesn't put the gun down. He gets shot, I believe, fatally. The gun that the guy had was actually an airsoft pistol, but it was a replica. It looks exactly like a gun, a very menacing looking gun, by the way. And the immediate story that gets out there is that it was a toy. So the way it's being described on social media and even in regular media is the officer shot the person because he had a toy gun. Well, of course, you hear that story, you're thinking of like the big orange and green, like super soaker, right? Like, why would a police? Yeah. Well, it looks like a real gun. So as a media person, as a media relations person, a communications professional, you thought it'd be a good idea to put a photograph of the actual, what looks like a gun before the media and put it out via social media. So everybody knows what we're talking about. Of course, I, at the time, was still stuck in a more traditional, nope, it's part of the investigation. We got to protect that. We can't just be willy-nilly putting pieces of evidence out to the media until the investigation is concluded. Well, you win, and we did it, and it worked. I mean, it worked great. it shut down any future controversy. There was no more public concern about the shooting. Everyone understood. You could see it. It was a very menacing looking, appeared to be a firearm. And the story just went away, which of course is what you want. If you're a police leader or the police officer involved, you want the investigative process to play out and be concluded and for your name not to be sullied. So I don't just say that to toot your horn. I just say your approach works. And I learned that like directly. So everything you're saying, I'm a complete believer in.
And we battled about, I mean, we had a respectful, but we were both really, firmly believed that each of us was right about it. And if I'm not mistaken, we took it to the chief. Like, hey, the chief liked us both. Julie thinks this, Jason thinks this. Chief, how do you want to handle this? And fortunately, he chose my side.
Well, he was wise to do that. And, obviously, if I had it down, I would never even have argued the other side because it's just obvious now to me. I mean, it's kind of like once you see it, you're like, oh, it actually solves the problem. Why wait to have a problem that you have this battle back from later when the investigation is over? And that was the way things were done always. I mean, that's just the way it was. And that's when you have people thinking like cops, right? I mean, thinking like a cop doesn't always help you. You need to have other perspectives, and it worked. And so that's why I'm a believer. And knows what would happen in that case if we hadn't put that photograph out in the public mind. Just like the hands up, don't shoot. The public is thinking the cop shot a guy because he had a toy. Like, no, it's not a toy. So,
and remember, it was in the grass, and the shooting happened when it was dark out. But then all of the reporters are there for the morning, and they're waiting as the sun comes up to see what they can see. And the gun is laying in the grass where we know the media is going to have access to that. So we put it out before they did because our mindset was we are going to break our own news. This is our incident with our people. And who better to share the information? The public can do with it what they will. If they believe us, awesome. If they don't, okay, then follow the media who is also covering a story. But because we had such a strong relationship and they trusted us, we gave the media access. Take a picture, get your video of the weapon that's in the grass right there by that evidence marker over there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you talk to a lot of police chiefs. You consult with them on these issues. Is it a tough line for them to walk? I mean, when you're dealing with a crisis, you have so many different audiences that you have to address at the same time. And the two that I'm mostly thinking about is the public. As a police leader, you want to make sure the public overall remains confident in your organization. That's your job. The public confidence is number one. So you have to be transparent as possible. You have to get as much information as you possibly can out to the public so that they can, again, start to form an opinion about what happened based on facts. You can't put everything out, obviously, as much as we talk about transparency being good. There's still an investigation that has to happen. You can't put every fact before the public. But importantly, you also have the internal audience. So the police officers that actually work in the organization, and you can't lose them. So when you have a crisis where it is not clear whether the officers involved were right or wrong, it's not, there are times we make it sound like it's always very clear that the cops are right, but that's not always the case. So when you're advising police leaders and they're almost caught in this little trap where they have to be as transparent as possible, they have to maintain public trust, so they have to be as honest. You can't put your thumb on the scale. You have to be very objective about it. But at the same time, you have to show the rest of the organization that you support them and you support the work that they do, and you're not turning your back on them. Because if you do that, especially in a big city police department, you're pretty much done. You're not going to be there much longer if you lose the confidence of the internal, the police officers in your organization. How do you help them walk that line?
We just did a training event, and it was the first time we've ever done this topic, and now I'm really passionate about it. The conference, their theme was wellness, officer wellness. And when the training coordinator came to me and said, I'd like you to present, I said, thank you, but I'm not your wellness person. And she said, no, I think we can get there through the crisis communications work that you do. And so we started talking that through. And if you look at a critical incident or something, some very high profile incident, like a use of force that's been captured and gone viral on social media, and you think about it from the officer's perspective, especially one who is directly involved in that incident. Now place yourself in the shoes of that police leader. If I'm that officer, I want to hear something from the head of the agency, in whether it's personally to me, but preferably an internal message goes out for the agency about the fact that we're dealing with a viral incident involving one of our officers. The media is covering it. It's all over social media. I want you to hear from me. And before that organization ever pushes out anything on social media, before they do a media interview, someone should be identified, ideally today during a blue skies time. Who is your lead internal communicator? It's not necessarily your media person, your PIO. It could be, if your agency is large enough where you have a chief of staff, it could be someone who's on your, like you. I mean, you were an attorney. You knew how to write well. Like, you've got to have someone who can communicate to the department. And to your point, being very careful about what it is that you're saying, because you've got to remain as the head of the agency who ultimately will sign off on that investigation. You can't say certain things. And so one of the most basic things we advised is you need to have someone in charge of internal communications. Find out who internally is your best communicator, not the chief, not the sheriff. Take that person out of the mix. They're going to be otherwise occupied potentially. But whether it's an assistant chief, deputy chief, a strong writer who can send out a message to the agency before you start communicating externally. And you might say, well, they're going to see it on our social. They're going to see it in the media. Well, that's not the same thing as hearing directly from the agency head about what it is that's going to happen. What's the process going to be? What's my role as the chief? And it's just another way to make the people who work for you feel supported, and that you took a minute to pay attention to them and how they're dealing with whatever that incident is.
I don't think you can overstate the importance of, if you're a police chief or a sheriff in a 3-person department or a 30,000 person department, how important it is that the chief or sheriff remain connected with the internal. Not forget, there's a whole bunch of people, obviously there's intense public interest about some controversial incident, and it's their job as the head of the agency to represent the agency before the public. But to forget about the people, the men and women who are actually tomorrow are going to show up to roll call and go out there and try to do this difficult job, to not feel supported is the end. So you can't, it doesn't, even if it's obviously it's a problem, the incident itself is a real problem. There's maybe obvious wrongdoing or something like that. You can't forget, because people, once they, and I've seen it many times in my career, once they don't feel supported anymore, your days are pretty much numbered. You're just not going to be leading the agency anymore. That's the bottom line. So, with that in mind, Julie, if there were a chief or a sheriff, or someone in senior leadership in any law enforcement, any one of the 18,000 plus law enforcement agencies in the United States, who introspectively takes a look and says, you know what? I don't think I or my senior staff or our agency is ready for what could happen later today that would thrust us before the national news potentially. I don't think we're ready for that. What should they do?
That is so important to know now. When you're in the thick of it and dealing with the crisis, that is not the time to figure out who can I turn to. If you can find someone at the jurisdiction level, regional, state, or find a firm like us and identify them in advance and get to know them, to vet them, find out if you trust them. You will not have time once the thing starts to unfold. You want to know them in advance, and you're putting your reputation in that firm or that person's hands. They have got to be someone you know, like, and trust.
And so if if they want to find you, how do they do that?
You can go to Julie Parker CO, julieparkerco.com. You can email me directly at julie@julieparkerco.com. I'm always on LinkedIn and happy to help.
You are not disconnected from any form of social media at any time. The best I can tell.
No.
So, great. Well, Julie, thank you so much for joining us. I was looking forward to this interview, and there's a reason why. I think it's just for anyone who is or is not intensely aware of these issues. This is, I think, extremely informative information coming from you. So, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. Be sure to follow us on X at LELDF and look into the show notes for more information about what we talked about in this episode. And join us next time. And in the meantime, go on and give us a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice. Thank you again.